Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the first weekend of August 2024. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orifei Divangi, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news from our Franklin News Foundation's Chalkboard News team. Today, we'll discuss the new landscape of the presidential race. We'll hear about the Title IX rules that went into effect this week, and we'll look at the efforts by Congress to get answers about the July 13th assassination attempt on former President Trump. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. The new presidential race is beginning to take a more definitive shape after the upheaval of the past 2 weeks. Dan McCabe's here to tell us more.
It was another busy week in the campaign for president as Kamala Harris inches closer to the official Democratic nomination. A virtual roll call is ongoing with nearly 4,700 Democratic delegates voting virtually to solidify Harris's nomination. And Republican former President Donald Trump attacks what he says are the current vice president's policy failures from years past. Joining me to discuss all things presidential election is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. bureau chief for the Center Square. Casey, there's so many directions we could go here. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, we could start with the polling. I think that's where you have to start in a horse race. What does it look like? And, you know, Dan, I'm following this daily here in D.C., and it seems like every day there's some new poll that comes out and someone declares that this is the state of the election. Trump holds a slight lead nationally, or Harris is leading. And my takeaway, you know, about almost, but not quite, almost 2 weeks into this race is that this is a tie. At the national level. Some polls seem to show Harris leading just a bit. Others show Trump leading a little bit more. And then a few seem to show a tie. And so that tells me that nationally we have a tie. Now, in the battleground states, there can be a different picture. We don't have as many reliable polls in those battleground states yet. And of course, in the Electoral College, that's what it all comes down to. Now, that battleground state issue takes us to the vice presidential candidate issue, Dan. J.D. Vance, the Ohio senator for Trump, I think he's had a bit of a rocky start getting into this campaign. He's, you know, as Kamala Harris has, he's taken fire for past comments he made, past stances he's taken. You know, Harris has taken fire for defund the police comments since she announced her run, and Vance has taken fire for some comments around, you know, abortion or around, you know, children and different things. Like tax policies for children. And so that makes Harris's vice presidential pick really important. Of course, a lot of people are thinking she might pick Shapiro out of Pennsylvania because she wants those Midwestern states. So I think that nationally, this looks like a tie. In the battleground states, it looks like there's too much fog of war and things to be not yet determined. We're seeing Vance having a little bit of a tough start here, but I do think he still has a bright future in the Republican Party. He's just getting a level of national attention he's not used to. And the next big news peg here, Dan, is who is Kamala going to pick for her VP?
So we're just a couple weeks away from the Democratic National Convention, which will be in Chicago. Casey, we're still waiting, as you mentioned, on Kamala Harris's VP pick. Do you expect to get that in the coming days, by Monday, early next week? Do we have any idea there?
I mean, if I had to put money on it, I would say next week we're going to find that out. I think she wants to have that settled, to help build momentum, pick a good candidate, go into this convention with her VP, with her delegates, and spike the football at this convention. She's the presumptive Democratic nominee. There's no question about that, but she does need to cement it to dot the I's and cross the T's at the convention in August. And I think the Harris playbook right now is to not make any big mistakes. She's doing pretty well, doing much better than Biden was doing. The media is kind of covering for her in a way that I've never seen in a long time, maybe since Obama. But Obama was a great candidate, a much stronger candidate than Harris is. And so she has like a widespread support from the media. And I think that's because the media feels responsible for taking Biden down, especially the kind of mainstream media and traditionally left-leaning media. They went really hard to remove Biden after the debate, and they were kind of uncharacteristically critical of him. And then when he finally did remove, Harris steps up to replace him. And I think they feel kind of this obligation to make sure that they're not the reason that Trump gets elected. I know some of these people, this is how they think. For instance, after 2016, when Trump won, they felt very responsible for getting Trump elected because of how they covered him, how they gave him so much attention. And so we saw in the next election, they ignored Trump much more because they felt that responsibility. So I think we're seeing that with Harris. If she picks a good VP, she does well in this debate, it's going to be a competitive race for her. And I think she has a good chance of winning right now, actually.
Nothing would surprise me the way this entire campaign season has gone on, Casey. If you reference President Biden, who just weeks ago was the presumptive Democratic nominee, he's largely disappeared. We don't hear from him much about anything anymore. There were questions when he initially exited the race a couple of weeks ago via social media, not via announcement, not via public appearance or anything like that. There were questions about his health. Of course, there's been ongoing questions on his health. How much of a factor do you think President Biden will be in this newly constituted race?
Yeah, if Democrats have their way, he'll be no factor at all. I think they're ready to kind of just put him out to the retirement home. And the media, I think, is willing to do that too. They've moved on. They're not criticizing Biden. Even Republicans are largely not talking about Biden or his record anymore. You're not hearing about Hunter Biden's laptop or any of these investigations. Everyone, I think, has moved on and is willing to give Biden a pass. Now, he's sort of reinserted himself into the news cycle by going for the Supreme Court reform. And I think he is trying to save his legacy by doing that. He's trying to appease the liberals who've wanted Supreme Court reform for a few years now. Ever since, there's more conservative justices, they've become very passionate about Supreme Court reform and term limits. But Biden is doing things like that, which are controversial. I don't think he's going to that's not going to happen this term. Congress is going to be focused on recess and campaigning. But he might be laying some policy framework that Harris could pick up and run with if she does win. And I think if, Democrats do get, all three House, Senate, and presidency, I think they'd be very interested in changing the Supreme Court. But right now they don't have that. So it's kind of an irrelevant proposal at the moment. So I think Biden is just riding into the sunset and trying to preserve his legacy. And you saw that even when he gave his White House address where he nominated Harris informally, but he passed the torch to Harris, as he called it. He spent much of that speech talking about his own record and things that he had done well across his entire political career. So it seems that he's very concerned about how he's perceived and his legacy as he leaves the White House, a one-term president.
Well, it is still early August. We had 3 long months of this campaign left to go. With all the twists and turns that we've already seen, who knows where that next twist or turn is going to come from. Thank you for joining us today. Casey, listeners can keep up with all presidential campaign news and more at thecentersquare.com.
A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the Title IX rules that went into effect this week, it's our Eliana Kernoval.
The Biden administration's new Title IX rules went into effect on August 1st, expanding the law's original sex discrimination standards to include gender identity and pregnancy. Several lawsuits have led to preliminary injunctions in over half of states, including one lawsuit that was appealed and received an injunction hours before the rules were set to take effect. Joining me to tell us more is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. So Brendan, these rules are only going into effect in some states now. What's the landscape as of today?
Yeah, it's pretty piecemeal, honestly, Eliana. And that's sort of the the issue with this is that it's not like going across the board, right? In terms of implementation, like there's not just like, okay, here we are launching it on August 1st. This is the deadline, and put it on across the board. There's actually more states now that won't implement it than will, right? So there's been 26 states have received statewide injunctions through lawsuits. Basically, the states themselves, different organizations, but specifically in these cases, the state attorney generals have filed lawsuits against the Department of Education and have received, the court has said in those cases that the Department of Education, the Biden administration will not be able to enforce its rules surrounding Title IX and expanding its definition, as you said, to include gender and pregnancy and some of like these other kinds of factors, sort of vastly expanding the law. They will not be able to put that into effect as of today, August 1st, because of the ongoing litigation. Essentially, they have a good chance of winning on the merits, and that the plaintiffs, the states and organizations and individuals, their rights could be, they could be harmed if the rule goes into effect. And they were able to successfully show that in court. And then more confusingly, so it's not just those states, there's also schools, specific schools and institutions of higher learning, colleges and universities, that are also prohibited from implementing the rule based on like litigation as well. Essentially, like these organizations said, if this goes into effect, it will harm our members. And so there's a list of schools, thousands of schools are on it. And those are in states like California and Washington, states that have maybe a very liberal attorney general, right? And a lot of Democrat-leaning leadership. And they are also going to be enjoined, prohibited from implementing the Biden rule because of the court orders. And
a lawsuit led by Alabama really came under the wire, receiving an injunction the day before these rules went into effect yesterday. What were the events leading up to that?
Yeah, so it's kind of crazy to follow, and I was able to follow it, as it was kind of happening in real time. Essentially, basically, they heard from a lower court that their motion for an injunction to stop the Biden rule from going into effect was denied on July 30th, and so then that evening on the 30th. After they'd gotten word from the district court, they filed a motion to appeal and basically asked for emergency relief. And so then they were saying, we're hours ahead of the deadline, and they were filing this at like 11 p.m. on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, the court, hours before the rule was supposed to go into effect, said, we will grant the emergency injunction. So that happened, Wednesday, like late afternoon, early evening, and basically said, we're going to grant this in these 4 more states, right? So that was Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, I believe. And so, they basically said, here's another 4 states, and that brought the total up from 22 to 26. And that happened all at the 11th hour. And they basically said, we just got this decision back hours before the deadline, that we're trying to get this as we're trying to figure this out. So basically stop this, and then we'll continue to talk about it in court, but you need to stop it now. And the court said that's fine. Let's do that. And then, I think that's a pretty quick turnaround in terms of litigation. They have to have stuff filed next week. So not a lot of time, I think kind of keeping in the spirit of that emergency administrative injunctive relief. These are very specific legal terms, but there are these, times in which you can ask the court for an emergency, let's stop this. And because you're showing that constitutional violations could happen, right? So it's a kind of, we start getting into these very technical sort of legal terminologies with this, and it kind of gets kind of confusing.
Well, and so part of the argument that they made was that this is right before the deadline. This lawsuit had been filed back in June, but it wasn't ruled until the 30th. And they were kind of arguing they just don't have a lot of time to sort this out. But what was kind of the opposing arguments to that?
Yeah, so I think that the Department of Education, in a very strongly worded reply, and some of these court documents, I love it when they kind of get, feisty, for the lack of a better word. It's really fun to kind of see okay, and you should have thought about this, But that was kind of the Department of Education's thing. It was look, we've had these out since April. And essentially, if you didn't do anything with that, that's your own problem. If you failed to take any kind of action because you were counting on this not working, then that's your fault. And so their sort of position is where the federal government, the default is that you will comply with these rules like while you're undergoing this litigation. So this is an emergency of your own making, essentially. And they also, the Department of Education is very much in the focus of like, we're expanding these rules to protect transgender students and other students, based on their gender identity, right? That we're expanding the definition. And, they kind of interpret the Supreme Court ruling in Bostock to basically like expanding the definition of sexual discrimination to include gender identity. So like this is the jump that they're making. They're saying based on this Supreme Court law, we're able to say that like gender identity is protected in sex discrimination. But it's kind of confusing because you can't necessarily convert that one-to-one with like education law. That was like a different kind of discrimination claim based on like workplace harassment. So it gets kind of like, again, legally complicated really quickly. But the Department of Education was basically, you guys should have been acting on this. This was the default. Like you need to comply with these rules. And the fact that you didn't is, your fault. So that was kind of their thing. And I've seen some of the courts in some of these things say like, look, you didn't give people a lot of time. I mean, a few months to basically file lawsuits and also to get ready and to comply with this. And separately, and it's different now because a lot, like more than half of states are not even going to be required to comply with this. But the cost for this is actually quite expensive. It's over $98 million by the Department of Education's own estimate to get all of this stuff in place. I mean, that's like hiring a coordinator, like making sure that people are trained, the coordinators are like know what's going on, and basically just like getting like all the schools in the United States up to speed with the new requirements. That costs like $98 million, over $98 million in the first year. So it's not cheap to, kind of change the law through these rules. And that's something that they estimated. So it's probably going to be, maybe around half that, maybe more with litigation. It's kind of hard to quantify how much it's going to cost.
Yeah, and the timing is very interesting because, of course, a day is definitely not enough time to institute these policies, but it does kind of raise that question of, is a few months enough time for something this expansive?
Well, and there's also some other timely sensitive, like, things that we're looking out for. So, like, there's the Supreme Court may issue a ruling on this because the Department of Justice in a couple of cases petitioned the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that they would weigh in on this. So there's a likelihood that the Supreme Court could weigh in at basically any time and, strike down this, issue an injunction, and basically as it decides whether this was lawful or not. So we're kind of waiting. We're on like Supreme Court watch for that. And so we kind of have to be ready to see what is the Supreme Court going to say about these new rules.
Yeah. And again, we're recording this on August 1st. So kind of right as the rules are going into effect, and we could see that at any moment. So keep an eye out for any of those updates at chalkboardnews.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Brendan. You've been listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with the latest on the Senate hearings, digging into the assassination attempt on former President Trump. It's our Dan McCaleb.
The congressional investigation into the U.S. Secret Service's failures leading up to and during the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump at a July 13th campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, heated up this week as a bipartisan group of senators grilled Acting Director Ronald Rowe about the lack of accountability and answers weeks after a sniper's bullet grazed Trump's ear and killed a spectator. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief. Casey, where are we at with this investigation?
This hearing that we had this week in the Senate with Ronald Rowe, the new acting head of the Secret Service, finally started to give us some of the details that Americans and lawmakers have been asking for. It's really the hearing that should have happened, last week when former Secret Service head Kimberly Cheadle appeared before Congress. Of course, we discussed this hearing. It was televised. It was became a viral moment. And if Cheadle had done last week what Rowe did this week, she might have been able to save her job, though it may have been a foregone conclusion that she would be pushed out. Because last week, when Cheadle was asked basic questions by lawmakers about what happened, what went wrong, very simple questions, she couldn't answer them. She said, we're only 9 days into this investigation. The FBI is looking into this. We can't give these answers just yet. And lawmakers became very upset and said, basically, why are you here? Like, how can you not give Congress basic answers to these questions, especially when you've been in the media giving more detailed answers, for example, in an interview with ABC News? And that hearing may have been 2 weeks ago. But anyway, Cheadle took a lot of fire and pretty much resigned shortly after that, despite previously the DHS secretary saying he backed her and was going to back her. But that hearing was the final nail in the coffin. And so we saw Cheeto go out. We saw Roe come in, and he came before lawmakers this week. And there were still some fiery exchanges, a lot of heat, but he was much more ready to give some answers to hard questions. And there's a few things that stood out, Dan. First off, apparently the Secret Service did have a drone that they wanted to use the day of the Butler rally where Trump was nearly killed. But they were having connectivity, technical difficulties basically with the drone, and were not able to use it. And that drone likely, according to experts in Roe, I believe, would have prevented the shooting, or very likely, because, the shooter was laying on a white rooftop, prone on a white rooftop. And so while it may have been a little bit difficult to see him from Trump's vantage point, not that difficult, an aerial shot would have clearly shown the outline of a human figure on a white rooftop, right? And we know from, different media reports that the shooter had his own drone that he flew at the site the day of the shooting. And so he was able to use that presumably to scout the area and look for firing lines and things like that. So that's the takeaway. And then before I hand it back to you, what I noticed was essentially that while he took much more responsibility than Cheadle, Roe did try to push things off on local law enforcement. And we've seen this kind of knife fighting in the media between local law enforcement and Secret Service, where Secret Service is trying to blame local law enforcement, and local law enforcement saying, what are you talking about? You're the Secret Service. We're just following whatever orders you give us. You tell us where to stand. And that's where we stand. I mean, you guys are in charge of protecting the president, and we're just helping you. So you can't really, blame us. But he did try to push the blame. And one thing that was interesting is local law enforcement did not have a good way of communicating with the Secret Service. They were kind of siloed in their communications. And so even if they had maybe seen him, or they weren't able to communicate well. And so that was a big failure in the security apparatus, and pretty concerning. And hopefully, Dan, we assume they're going to fix these things going forward.
As you mentioned, former Director Kimberly Cheadle was forced out. She resigned a little over a week ago. Acting Director Ronald Roe was grilled before Congress. There are plenty of Republicans in Congress saying U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, whose department oversees the Secret Service, should also resign. Do you expect any more fallout from this, Casey? What's next?
I think we could see some fallout from other Secret Service officials. I've seen some things online where people within the Secret Service are very upset with how this is handled, how they're being stifled. You could have some whistleblowers come forward. I think there would be a big appetite for a Secret Service whistleblower to come forward. What does this counter sniper think? We still haven't heard, that would be a pretty incredible interview, a pretty incredible testimony before Congress. And if that counter sniper were able to point some fingers, it could put pressure on other people. I don't think Mayorkas is going anywhere until the end of this presidential term. The Republicans have been trying to impeach him, get rid of him for months and months, unsuccessfully. He only has a few more months in Biden's term. I think he's going to ride it out and transition to some other job, possibly in lobbying or something else. I'd be surprised if Harris would keep him on if she wins the White House, and Trump, of course, would not keep him on. So his days are numbered, but not because of this Secret Service investigation, in my opinion. Though I think lower level Secret Service officials could still be forced out if more whistleblowers do come forward.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Casey. Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. That'll do it for the first half of the Center Square Radio Hour. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. How has reinstituting police pursuits in Washington state impacted the number of suspects fleeing? How much time would students need to stem learning loss and catch up to pre-pandemic levels in math and reading? And how does parental employment and income levels impact children's long-term outcomes? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits. Some of the original reporting may have missed at thecentersquare.com. The Liberty Justice Center filed a First Amendment lawsuit against an Oregon school district on behalf of a high school track and field coach who the district fired for proposing an open division for male athletes who identify as transgender. The Lake Oswego School Board fired head track and field coach John Parks after he wrote a letter proposing an open division for what was then the upcoming track and field state championship. The call for change came during a season when a transgender athlete from Portland won an Oregon School Activities Association Class 6A Girls State Championship in the 200-meter race. Parks coached 2 runners who competed in the race, the Liberty Justice Center said. A federal judge ordered the University of California to create a plan for maintaining equal campus access for Jewish students after pro-Palestine protesters established ideological checkpoints, blocking off portions of the UCLA campus. 3 Jewish students said that pro-Palestine demonstration sites limited their access to central parts of the campus and that they were told they would be unable to pass through unless they disavowed Israel's right to exist. The lawsuit also details pro-Palestine demonstrators' use of an identification system by which they gave wristbands to those who had passed their anti-Israel ideological test. 1 year after Texas installed marine barriers in the Rio Grande River near Eagle Pass, Texas, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit ruled the state has the legal right to do so. It also reversed a district court's preliminary injunction and remanded the case to the court, quote, with instructions to vacate the preliminary injunction and for further proceedings consistent with this opinion, end quote. Texas has been embroiled in ongoing legal battles with the Biden administration over border security measures. The U.S. national debt topped $35 trillion this week, a grim milestone for the U.S. government and the economy as the national debt continues to soar. The national debt has nearly tripled in the past 20 years. Medicare and Social Security are on the path to insolvency because of the worsening fiscal situation, according to budget groups. The cost of interest on the national debt has doubled since President Joe Biden took office and is on track to be the single largest expense for the federal government, more than entitlements for national defense. The city of New Orleans and the Orleans Parish School Board are working together to use $2.5 million in federal American Rescue Plan money to build a high school football field. The school district stated in public documents that the project would, quote, accomplish the valuable public purpose of improving health and wellness outcomes by constructing a public recreational facility on publicly owned land in a community that was disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, end quote. The American Rescue Plan was intended to help communities recover from restrictions put in place during the pandemic. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on police pursuits in Washington State, it's our Cole Lauterbach.
The argument behind banning police chases in 2021 was that they caused more harm than help in apprehending criminals. Now that Washingtonians have forced lawmakers to repeal the law, Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson spoke to one county that is seeing another side effect. Carlene?
Yeah, Cole, the Thurston County Sheriff's Office, right on June 6th, the first day that Initiative 2113 took effect in state law, they were right on top of it. They said, as of this day, June 6th, our first opportunity to sort of loosen restrictions on policing, they did it. And they have been consistently posting to Facebook videos or sometimes, still images with a description of high-speed chases and the result of the reason for some of those and then the result, and they're catching some bad guys.
Now, explain the details of just exactly what was banned initially in 2021, or I guess in 2022 when it took effect, and then what was undone by the ballot initiative.
So, House Bill 1054 was passed and signed into law in 2021. You recall that was still kind of right in the middle of the whole defund police movement that kind of resulted from, Black Lives Matter protests, the George Floyd murder, all of that. But what it did was severely restrict police officers' ability to chase. It said, unless you have not reasonable suspicion that someone has done something wrong, but probable cause that, to arrest a person in a vehicle for committing a specific violent crime, sex offense, or DUI. So it basically said, only if you know this guy is, truly a bad guy, committed an offense that you're certain you can follow through on, you better not give chase. And what it did, as anybody in the state of Washington knows, is it, gave the bad guys the upper hand because police stopped pursuing. Even if they saw somebody running out the front of a 7-Eleven store and they'd gotten a call from the manager saying, this guy just stole stuff and he's got a gun or whatever. The guy jumps in the car and takes off. 9 times out of 10, police did not chase that guy, and the bad guy knew they wouldn't get chased.
Exactly. And that's that to my next point is fleeing suspects got smart to the ban. I mean, we had seen some famous videos about, go back off. You can't chase me, right?
Yeah, they knew that. They knew they had the upper hand, and it led to huge spike in crime statistics in the state of Washington. I mean, find me somebody in the state right now who either hasn't had their car stolen, probably a Kia, or some other, or their neighbor had a car stolen in the state of Washington in the last few years. We all know somebody who went through that. And that's because even if police spotted a known stolen vehicle, they could not pursue under the restrictions until the initiative took effect on June 6th.
1/5 of our Washington team has had their car stolen in the meantime of the police chase ban. Interesting factoid.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Cole, but then all the other related crimes, right? Because we gave the bad guys the upper hand, knowing they could steal the cars and get away with them at the same time that Washington state basically decriminalized hardcore drugs. And so you compounded that, and we have had astronomical spikes in crime, from robbery to burglary to, and then the ripple effect of all that and what it's done to people just having a total lack of trust for, a community safety. It's going to take a while to turn this thing around. Yeah.
And to that point, the violent crime is what spiked during that time, even though you just recently reported it did go down a little bit. Now, not every police agency, Carlene, immediately loosened restrictions on, it was June 6th when the law took effect. In fact, the state's largest county only made changes as of just this last Thursday, correct?
Yeah, just on Thursday, King County Sheriff's Department finally approved and made changes that, take effect as of August 1. Now, keep in mind that the initiative allowed all of these law enforcement agencies to come up with their own rules. So you have some more liberal leaning law enforcement agencies, King County Sheriff's Department being one of them. But they're the largest in the state, and they contract with 6 other surrounding cities. So you've had all these cities that up until August 1 were going, hey, wait a minute, everybody else around us is able to pursue again. Why aren't we doing it? Finally, they did it. But their pursuit policy, which again, as you mentioned, took effect on the 1st, came after the changes, but they still have some really strict limitations. They can pursue now for dangerous felonies, DUI, burglary, but they do not have near the lessening of restrictions, I would say, as some of the other agencies like Thurston County. So, it's kind of a piecemeal thing. It's going to be interesting in the weeks and months to come to see how that works, especially when a bad guy being pursued crosses over from one county to the next.
Now, the sheriff you spoke to, and it was Thurston County, he had some interesting data to share with you that, showed that they were pursuing more because, they could, but there was an interesting side effect, right?
Yeah, he said there are in fact more pursuits that had happened, and they took it was like a 10-day period that was, basically from the middle of July towards the end of the month. And they did pursue a number of vehicles. You got these guys on a bunch of high-speed motorcycles. They had several of them that fled. Thankfully, nobody was seriously hurt in the crashes. And in one case, they did pursue, because I said, well, you're not pursuing for equipment violations, are you? And he said, well, actually, if it's 2 a.m. and there's an equipment violation, there's nothing else going on, I've got officers out there, we can now pursue. They ended up catching 2 drug dealers in a car after these guys crashed into a tree. One of them had 9 warrants out for very serious drug crimes. So even though it was a broken taillight or whatever else the equipment violation was, they ended up catching some really bad guys and getting them off the street because they can now pursue.
Yeah. The one video that they posted online about that showed the police camera footage about one of the guys that they chased and caught. And he said, I thought you guys couldn't chase me. And he said, well, that law changed, bud. But oh, man. Well, thank you, Carlene. Good story. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Cole and Carlene. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the ongoing impacts of COVID-era education policies, let's Let's go back to Eliana Cronulla.
An education organization that administers a nationwide assessment has found that students are still not performing as well as they were immediately before the COVID-19 pandemic, and that students' achievement gap worsened in the 2023-2024 school year as compared to before COVID. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, the NWEA issued a report this week. What are the details? What did it show?
Yeah, so basically it was bad news. And they basically found that, despite this initial jump in achievement, because of some, targeted efforts to try to help combat learning loss after the pandemic, that has not continued. So, at the end of 2021, 2022, the NWEA concluded that the worst was behind us and the recovery had begun. But unfortunately, and this is from the report, data from the past 2 school years no longer support that conclusion. Growth has slowed to lag pre-pandemic rates, resulting in achievement gaps that continue to widen and, in some cases, now surpass what we had previously deemed as a low point, unquote. So that's from the report. Basically, it's continued bad news in terms of we're still seeing the ongoing effects of these pandemic-era closures, right, where their schools were closed, they were online, or, there's interrupted learning and that kind of thing. And I think it's very interesting. There's a lot of different kinds of data here. You can really, really dig into this. And I think that's the hard part about writing about this, is that there's so many interesting things to kind of think about. But, the youngest students, third graders, they were impacted less than 8th graders, for example. And so I think there's some interesting kinds of data. There was actually, for third graders in reading and math, there was actually some negative changes in the gap. So there were some good increases. But if you look at the 6th graders and the 8th graders in reading, for example, there's an 82% change in the gap between the fall 2023 and the spring 2024 in reading. So there are some of these very interesting, I think they're very interesting to look at some of the age differences, right? And if you look at how much time it would take for students to reach pre-pandemic achievement levels, in 8th grade, it would take a whole school year, basically nine months in reading and 9.3 months in math for 8th graders to catch up to where they were before the pandemic. For third graders, it's only 1 month for math and it's 3 months for reading. So it's not completely the same. And part of that, I think, is, you can sort of catch up a lot more if those critical years, right, are not interrupted. So I think, there's a lot of importance about that reading by third grade. And if you were in preschool, during COVID, it's probably not going to be as much of a deal to kind of jump back into things as a first or second grader. But if you were in third grade and now you're in 6th grade or now you're in 8th grade, that might have more of that effect. So I think it's interesting to see that, and I think too, it's that younger students tend to make, this is from the report, younger students tend to make larger gains per year compared to older students. And so, it's just that's a very interesting part of that data too. But there's a lot of different interesting things to pull from this. And
what are the possible solutions to this?
Yeah, that's sort of the big question, right? Of how do you fix this? I think that the NWEA would say it's important to basically focus up and spend a lot more money on targeted support for these students. And I think that's their push, right? Is that we need to focus on targeting especially those, and this is something that the report said as well, that those who were sort of farthest behind before the pandemic, they've fallen even farther behind, right? So we're talking about low income students, minority students, they're doing worse today than they were before COVID, when they were already doing worse, right? So I think that's something that they would say is you need to target sort of academic supports and high dosage tutoring, summer programming, basically saying we cannot let up on those and that those have to be a part, the NWEA says, a permanent part of our new normal, unquote. So basically just giving them that extra instructional time that's what they say is the only way to make meaningful progress. So I think, basically too, and something that they're staring down and cognizant of, and a lot of school districts are thinking about this too, is that the federal COVID relief is running out. And so I think that, we're going to have some of these aftershocks that we're going to see down the road in future years, even of we still have students struggling because of these COVID shutdowns. And we're starting to see the massive significance of that. but then also we've run out of federal funds. So schools at some point they were always going to be left to try to figure it out. And that day is coming, and that's coming in September. So this year is September. That's the fiscal cliff that people keep talking about with the federal COVID relief spending. So it's going to be really difficult for schools to get students back up to speed, back to where they were before COVID, without that additional funding. And, because you need to pay people to be at schools for their summer program. A lot of this takes money. And I think, we're kind of seeing how costly both in academic achievement and also in terms of the financial side of things, the COVID-19 school lockdowns were, right? And I think that that's something that, it's hard to quantify, with federal spending like that went to a lot of different stuff. And, we've reported a little bit about that at Chalkboard. There's a lot of different things that federal COVID money has gone to. But there's also, the toll on students, academic achievement. And I've spoken to a researcher who said, essentially, there's like a COVID class, or he called it COVID credentials, I believe, that the students who graduated during COVID, like they kind of got through just because they had to. And you can't keep them there because there was a global pandemic.
It does kind of raise that interesting question of normally if a student was a year behind in their reading level, their math level, you would have to ask the question of, does this student need to repeat the grade? But if the majority of students are in that boat, can you really hold an entire year of 8th graders back a year? Then you're having twice as many 8th graders and no 9th graders.
Right. And that's it. It's like how can you hold them responsible for something that wasn't their fault? Like nobody's fault that COVID happened and that everything had to be shut down and the learning was not the same. But that's the interesting thing is like you can't really do that.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. It's something that we have been following and we will continue to follow as more information comes out. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to dig into the connection between parental employment and children's outcomes is PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Hey, Dr. O, you and I try to trade interesting stories in the news that we see to each other. You sent one my way that was kind of interesting. Not to say the others that you send me aren't interesting. The vast majority of the stuff you send my way, I find it fascinating in most cases. But this story from the New York Times over the past couple of days, talking about the differences in upward mobility by demographics. And this is based on a study in which I believe that the study participants were born between 1980 and
1978 and 1992.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's like some stark contrast in there, in particular among poorer white people and poorer black people. And what is the study saying? And then what's your take on it?
Basically, the earnings of those children that came from high income families increased, while the earnings of children from low income families decreased. And so you got kind of a class gap that increased, right? But then the earnings for black children of all parental income levels actually increased, right? Closing the gap by about 30%. Now, so you got a race gap that shrank and you got a class gap that grew.
Interesting.
And part of the story is that while the earnings of black children increased, the children of all parental incomes, families of all parental incomes increased, it was not necessarily true for white children. And the study basically shows that it had everything to do with employment rates. In places where you had kids were surrounded by adults that worked, those kids did better. And so, when you consider a little bit the fact that a lot of the jobs that, I think of Detroit and some parts of the Pennsylvania that basically were affected by job loss and maybe some industries shifting, going overseas, it does make sense that people that lived in those areas, may not have seen the kind of mobility that others have seen, specifically, especially those who lived on the coast of the United States, for example, closer to these big job centers, with the rise of the internet, but also the tech industry, et cetera, et cetera.
So, is there anything to the geography of this? Is this study capturing in any way the investment in large metropolitan areas versus the disinvestment in small town America, where manufacturing used to occur? I think about, I live in the state of Illinois. I think about downstate Illinois. It's rural, yes, of course, and it's extremely tilted in terms of demographics, largely very white. The economic prospects, in towns like, Metropolis and Cairo, Illinois, places like that. Is this like a sort of an articulation of American manufacturing just kind of going away in small town America?
Well, I think so. First, I think most economists would agree that there's a clear link between your outcomes and your parents' outcomes. And so if your parents are doing well, you're likely to do better than someone whose parents are doing so well. And you talk about this investment, and ultimately, right, when you think about investment, you think of both public and private investment. And that investor has to yield some sort of return. Otherwise, nobody will actually go ahead and invest there. I think it speaks to the fact that, we've promised the return of those jobs to American people who live in those areas forever.
Yes.
And the reality is it's unlikely that those jobs are ever coming back. And so we have to stop making false promises. And I say I'm really talking about the federal government. Now we're talking about making chips in the United States. And let's be honest, making chips in the United States will cost too much. Making chips in the United States will make things less affordable, right? Today, we're walking around with these phones that are computers in our pockets because we're able to make chips a lot cheaper in places like Taiwan. And so, and this is kind of what I'm hearing. You talk to people who actually invest money and for others, and they say, look, let's just be honest. Ideas like, hey, Taiwan should pay for its own defense, blah, 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 when essentially we are the ones benefiting a great deal from chips being manufactured in Taiwan, doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're trying to increase mobility, if you're trying to get people access to decent retirements, et cetera, right? What we need to be doing is to stimulate economic growth, hopefully create an environment where inflation is low and stable, but also an economy that benefits everyone. And if we're not going to do that by engaging in trade wars and putting tariffs and all of those things and regulating the economy.
I appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. The Center Square Radio Hour is a production of America's Talking Network, produced by Eliana Kernodle. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it at americastalking.com. I'm Chris Krug, and on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation, thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.